Thank you, Janelle. Before I start from my talk, I guess I'd like to emphasize something. In Grant's presentation, he showed a lot of difficulty in getting decay and termites to attack. And that's a misconception, because one of the troubles we have in laboratories is getting them to perform like they do in the field. So don't take away the message that they aren't going to be a problem. Take away the message that we're still working on how to make them a problem in labs, but we'll get there. The other thing that I want to take away is there's a general fear of preservatives, and there's sort of a 4-letter word with some extra letters in them. But in many cases here, you really need to consider some types of other protection. It isn't just going to be the wood alone that's going to work in some of the applications where you want to use them. And so think about that very carefully. My job today is to talk about something we haven't done yet, so this will be interesting. But we're going to talk a little bit about performance of coatings and see if that works. I do have it upside down. It's amazing. As my child would tell me, I'm not technologically proficient. I think over the past 2 days, we've learned there's a lot of opportunity in mass timber, and there's a lot of excitement. And last year, there were about 700 or 800 people here, and this year, there are about 1,200 people. And I think that shows the growing trend towards considering these materials. But with that opportunity comes risk. And this is also a picture of the PV Hall building, which is going up on our campus. And it's hard to see this because it's very hidden in the shade, but there are lovely examples of mold and iron stain in this building. And it's because it was built with the expectation that it wouldn't get wet while it was being built during the winter. And so only the exterior parts were coated with protection. And that's something that people really need to learn, is that when you build in the winter in the west coast of the United States, you are going to get wet. We were exceptionally lucky this year in that it only rained about half as much as it should have in the time frame that this particular section of building went up, when it was exposed for 6 weeks. So I think people really need to learn to worry about wood protection during construction. And to the credit of the builders, they did start to take that into account, and this is an example of them trying to control some of the top wetting of the elements in the building. But there's lots of things that are going to happen with these materials, and we know that wood is going to weather when it's exposed. We know that mold will grow on the wood. And so the first thing is, well, why worry? Well, it's going to get covered up. No one's going to see it. It's going to be fine. But you worry for a couple reasons. One is we know that moisture is going to support algae and molds and eventually decay and possibly insects. And allowing that moisture to get in the first place is just creating a future problem. You can cover it up, but it's still going to be there. Exposed wood will ultimately weather and split and check, and it won't look good. And so taking the time to look at that beforehand is just worth the time to make the building look better for the longer period of time. And invariably, the moisture intrusion is going to lead to dimensional instability and checking and decay potentially occurring. And we can look around and see lots of examples. This happens to be our other building, where coatings tried to work but really didn't. And so the question you have is whether you should coat or not. And that is the question. Is it worth coating? And I think it is, and I think I want to talk a little bit about what we're trying to do with coatings. And this evolved out of last year's conference, because one of the things that occurred to me as we were talking to some of the architects was that people didn't know what coatings would do, whether they're good or bad. And so our ideas about coatings are, here's what a coating would be ideally. It's going to be easily applied. It's going to be long-lasting. And long-lasting doesn't mean forever. You have to remember that. It should be able to limit UV damage, even if it's a transparent or semi-transparent coating. It has to have some water repellency, although remember that water repellency is not water exclusion. It's a slowing down of the moisture uptake, but not completely. It needs to be attractive. And ultimately, as we discovered in our building, it has to be cheap, because nobody wants to pay for it. We know that when you put panels out, even coatings will discolor. These are some examples from our test fence, and I don't know if they do show up okay. This is algal discoloration on panels in our test site, and we happen to have oak trees over the top of our panels, and you can see how quickly they algal discolor. That's about a year. This is mold growing on paint panels. So coatings, unless they're protected, will also develop issues, and so you have to be aware of that. In flat exposures, which is what this is a flat panel exposure with water wells around it. That worked. Water wells around it to keep the water in, and you can see all the debris that it collects and the mold and the algae. It's a living habitat, and so these things will happen fairly quickly if you're not careful about it. I also want to point out, before I talk about what we're trying to test, is that coatings are not everything. And this is a really good example of that. These are some Douglas fir timbers that are exposed in Hilo, Hawaii. And some of them are uncoated, and some of them are coated with polyurea, which is a coating that's used on truck bed liners. It has a lot of different uses around. It's an elastomeric coating, and you can put it on fairly thick. We exposed these particular timbers out in Hawaii for several years, and some of them were completely untreated. Some of them have preservative in them. But that's the coating after 6 years in Hilo, and you can see that it's quite falling apart. But the worst part about that was that this is decay that developed inside the coating. So the coating was not complete. You needed to have something else inside to make this work. So coatings alone without any type of biocide protection are unlikely to work over the long term. They're part of the solution, but they're not the only part of the solution. They're also not particularly resistant to termites. So you have to consider what you're doing and make sure you understand what it is you're going to look at. So are coatings worthwhile? Yes. They can repel water. They can limit UV damage. They can limit mold algal damage because they can keep water off them for longer periods of time. But they're not the only thing you're going to use. And so as part of your design, you really need to follow those 4 Ds that one of the speakers talked about, I believe, yesterday. You need to have drainage planes. You need to get rid of the water. And then you can start looking at other protection methods like coatings. So what coatings work? I don't know. And I don't think many people do. Most of the coating tests are proprietary. And one of the problems we have is that there aren't a lot of university labs that do coating research. FPL used to do quite a lot of it, and they're starting to get back into it, but there really is sort of a void there. And so our objective is to try and establish a good coating performance test, particularly of western wood species, so that architects in this region have an idea about what types of coatings will work. And what we're looking at are species you would expect to see, sort of the usual suspects from Casablanca. Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, western red cedar, radiata pine because it's being imported as a koya, as acetylated wood, and then red alder, which is also being looked at as acetylated wood. The red alder came into our test relatively late because it's going to be the exterior facade of our building. And so it would be really useful to know how that's going to perform. At least I thought so. And what we've done is we've collected a number of finishes, coating finishes, most of which are single coat finishes, but one of which is a multi-stage coating. And our idea right now is we're going to take all these coatings, and we would accept more. If you have ideas for coatings that we're not testing, please talk to me, because we'd be happy to include them. It's better to start it now than to decide 3 years later to add another coating. But what we're going to do is we're going to apply the systems, and we have applied the systems according to the manufacturer's instructions on all the faces of the panel. So there's no question about back or front in this case. We've determined the amount of coating by weight because it was hard to look at finish thickness and the things we were looking at. The panels are going to be scanned for color imagery, so we can get color changes over time from them, so we can look at changes visually. And then we're going to look at panel water repellency over time. And that's where we are right now. So these are examples of some of the panels. They've all been barcoded so we can track them over time. We're going to expose them at 3 sites. One is Corvallis, Oregon, where we get about 1 meter of rain a year. We have a relatively moderate average temperature, just like Portland. The UV exposure is sort of moderate. Even though it's cloudy, there's still a reasonable UV exposure in the summer. We're going to expose some in Klamath Falls, Oregon, because it's a lot drier and higher, and we expect the conditions there to be a little bit different. And then we're going to expose the final set in Hilo, Hawaii, because it's got a much more severe exposure conditions. They get about 3 meters of rain a year, temperatures warmer, and the UV exposure is much higher. And this will give us a chance to look at these exposures over time. They'll be on racks like this, which is a pretty little rack that's actually out of Klamath Falls from a previous test we did. And what we'll look at is simple: water repellency, color changes over time, coating consistency, and hopefully we'll be able to get some inferences about how these materials will perform. And to give you an idea about what we're looking at, Grant talked about looking at water repellency. There's some sophisticated tools you can use for this, but you can also do it fairly simply. This is a water drop, in case you've never seen one in Oregon before. They happen a lot. But you can measure the angle of how it contacts the water, how it contacts the wood, and you can then rate it. And this is an example of a rating scale we use for looking at water repellency. And it works quite well. It's human-aided, but if you have the same operator running it, you get a pretty consistent set of tests. And then we'll be looking at the color coding quality over time, just using the flatbed scanner. And we'll pull panels out each year, scan them, and put them back out in the field, except for the Gila site where we expect to have to take them in and keep them because it's just hard to get things out there. So what do we expect to see? Well, hopefully in a year or two, we'll tell you kind of how things are working. Water repellency in many coatings will fade very quickly. We know that from some of our decking tests. But we can also look at the color changes. How does it change? Did it change like you expected it to see? Did you like it? Maybe you liked the color change. Maybe that fade was good. We don't know that, and that's sort of a human perception thing. We'll look at surface changes, and then hopefully the time frame, within 2 to 3 years, we'll have some feel for where things are going. In Hilo, that will happen a lot quicker. But our goal is to try and get a comprehensive test in the region that will tell you what you should or shouldn't be doing when you want to coat something. And that's about all I have, actually, except to say that this is a really exciting time for wood. It's a great time to be working with the material, and I think we're sort of lucky to be in that setting. And with that, I would thank you for your time, and presumably we're open for questions for all three of us. Thank you.